Wyoming Territory, early October, 1883. The wind howled over the plains like it was trying to tear the mountains down by their roots, and by the time Noelle Zimmerman spotted the ranch house through the sleet, her fingers were too numb to feel the reins. Her mare, soaked to the bone and shaking, limped the last 100 yards. Noelle would have fallen if she had not leaned into the saddle horn and grit her teeth. She had not planned to be out this long. She had not planned for anything past sundown. She had not planned for the storm. She just needed shelter for one night. The ranch house was plain and wide, with a low porch and a soft glow in the front window. Smoke curled from the chimney. It looked like the kind of place that would not turn away a woman alone in the cold. She dismounted stiffly and staggered up the steps, her boots sloshing with water. She knocked once, then again, harder. The door opened fast, and a tall man filled the doorway. His shirt was half unbuttoned, suspenders hanging at his sides, as if he had been in the middle of something. His dark blonde hair stuck out in damp curls near his ears, and his eyes, steady, sharp, and strangely soft, met hers. He looked about 28, maybe a year older than her. "You lost?" he asked. Noelle blinked rain from her lashes. "I just need a place to dry off. One night. I will be gone by morning." He studied her a second longer. Then he stepped back. "Get in here before you freeze." She moved past him, legs shaking. The warmth inside hit her like a wall. She had not realized how cold she really was. He shut the door behind her, then crossed to the fireplace. "Sit close. I will get you a towel." She hesitated only a moment before shedding her soaked coat and boots, then sat on the low stool near the hearth. When he came back with a heavy towel, she took it with both hands and started wringing out her hair. "You got a name?" he asked, kneeling to poke at the fire. "Noelle Zimmerman." He nodded slowly, then met her eyes. "Nathaniel Ellery." She gave him a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Nathaniel." He stood and motioned toward the table. "You eaten anything today?" She hesitated. Alive would take more energy than she had. "No, I made stew." "You will eat." Noelle did not argue. She followed him to the table, where he set out 2 bowls and filled them from a pot on the stove. The meat was tender, the broth hot. She ate until her hands stopped shaking. Nathaniel sat across from her, his bowl untouched, watching with a quiet sort of concern. "Where were you headed?" "Nowhere," she said, setting her spoon down. "I was just leaving." He leaned back in his chair. "Bad man?" "No, man." Her voice was flat. "Just bad years." He nodded once, like he understood. Maybe he did. The silence stretched out between them. The fire popped behind her. His eyes never left her face. When she looked up again, he spoke softly. "You can stay more than one night if you want." She shook her head. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not." "I live alone. House could use a little more life in it." Noelle looked away, unsure what to say. It was not until much later, when Nathaniel gave her the spare room and she lay beneath a warm quilt, that the tears came. Quiet, tired tears soaked into the pillow. She had not cried in months. Outside, the storm beat against the walls, but inside, it was still and warm. She stayed. One night turned into 2. Then 3. By the end of the week, she was helping in the kitchen, brushing down the horses, mending a torn curtain in the parlor. Nathaniel never asked questions, never pushed. He let her move at her own pace. He built her a shelf in the guest room for her things. He taught her how to handle his gentler mare, taught her how to move with the horse instead of against it. When she laughed for the first time in weeks, really laughed, he looked at her like he had never seen anything so worth watching. They ate dinner together every evening. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled in the hearth. One afternoon, as she swept the porch, a storm cloud moved in sudden and low. She turned to go inside, but Nathaniel was already behind her, tossing a blanket over her shoulders. "You always know when the rain is coming," she said. He shrugged. Comes with the land. She looked up at him. You always this kind to strangers? You do not feel like a stranger anymore. Noelle's breath caught. He had not said it softly. He had said it like it was just true. That night, she could not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the rain fall, her thoughts tangled. She had meant to keep moving. But something about Nathaniel made her feel like she did not have to. The next morning, she found him in the barn, brushing down one of the horses. I should leave, she said. He did not look up. Do you want to? No. He stopped brushing and turned to her. Then stay. Noelle's hands curled into fists at her sides. You do not know what I have been through. Then tell me. So she did. In the quiet of the barn, with dust hanging in the air and the horses shifting in their stalls, she told him everything. About the sickness that took her father. The creditors who took the land. The man who promised to help, then took what he wanted and left her with nothing. Nathaniel listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, she stared at the floor. I am not someone men stay for. He stepped forward and gently tipped her chin up so she had to look him in the eye. His voice was steady. Then I guess I am not like most men. She could not breathe. Stay, he said again. Not just for the night. For good. Her heart beat loud in her chest. She nodded. He smiled, just a little. And she knew. She was not going anywhere. Mid-October settled over the land with a gray quiet, the kind that made sound fall flat against the air. Noelle woke early, the quilt heavy on her legs and the faint creak of the windmill turning steady through the window. She dressed in layers and stepped into the morning chill, her boots pressing into frost-hardened dirt. Nathaniel was already in the pasture, coat collar turned up, lantern set beside him as he leaned over the fence rail. A roan calf stood awkwardly nearby, its front leg wrapped in a strip of muslin and tied with practiced care. She approached, careful not to spook the animal. Stepped in a hole yesterday, he said without turning. Didn't notice until she started limping this morning. Will she heal? He nodded, brushing his hands against his thighs. If she keeps off it. Might keep her in the corral a few days. Noelle crouched, eyes on the calf. You've done this before. Enough times. She glanced up. You were raised on land like this? Nathaniel met her gaze briefly, then looked toward the hills. Not this land. My father kept a homestead west of Cheyenne. We lost it the winter the cattle froze standing up. She stood, brushing her palms together. And you came here? Bought this piece from a man who didn't want to die in Wyoming. He paused. He didn't last through his first spring. Noelle didn't ask more. The weight in his voice was enough. She followed him back to the barn, her breath fogging in the cold. Inside, they worked side by side, pitching hay into stalls and refilling troughs. The silence between them was easy. She found she liked how he moved, efficient, quiet, nothing wasted. When the sun climbed high enough to melt the frost from the fence posts, Nathaniel leaned against the stable door and looked toward the ridge. Do you know how to shoot? She blinked. Some. Rifle or revolver? Rifle. My father taught me to hunt before the fevers took him. He nodded once. There's a coyote that's been circling the west pasture. Figured we could track it if you're willing. She hadn't expected that. You want me to come? I trust your eyes. He pushed off the doorframe. And I'd rather not walk that ridge alone. By mid-afternoon, they were halfway up the slope, their boots crunching through dry grass and loose shale. Nathaniel moved ahead, scanning the earth for sign. Noelle kept pace, rifle slung over her shoulder. The sky opened wide above them, a pale blue stretching clean to the edge of the world. After an hour, they paused in a patch of juniper. Nathaniel knelt, brushing 2 fingers across a set of fresh tracks. He's not far. Noelle crouched beside him. You always track alone? He hesitated. Used to. Then I realized it wasn't something I liked. Just something I did. She said nothing, but the words stayed with her. They didn't find the coyote that day. It was long gone by the time they reached the ridge's crown, but they lingered anyway, the wind rising in fits and starts across the open land. Nathaniel sat on a rock, pulling off his gloves. It's strange, isn't it? What is? How a place can be empty for so long, and then one day, it's not. She turned to him. He wasn't watching the horizon anymore. She held his gaze, the silence between them pulsing like something alive. That night, they didn't speak of the ridge or the coyote or the long path home. But when they sat at the table, their knees brushed under the wood, and neither of them pulled away. Nathaniel passed her a slice of cornbread, hands steady, eyes warm. You think you'd ever want to keep chickens? He asked casually. She blinked. Chickens? For eggs. Thought about building a coop. She chewed slowly. I could build one. He smiled, not wide, but real. Then maybe we ought to. After dinner, she stepped outside while he banked the fire. The stars above were sharp and cold, the kind that made you feel small in a right sort of way. When Nathaniel came out, he didn't say anything. Just stood beside her, arms folded, watching the sky. She tilted her head. You ever think about leaving this place? No, he said. Not since you came. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and distant wood smoke. He reached for her hand, just lightly, his fingers wrapping around hers with quiet certainty. She let him. By late October, the first snow clung to the tops of the distant hills, and the mornings came brittle and white. Noelle rose before the sun, pulled on the wool shawl Nathaniel had left folded at the foot of her bed, and stepped into the kitchen where the stove already glowed low with coals. Nathaniel stood near the counter, sleeves rolled to the elbow, slicing dried apples into a tin basin. His hair was still damp from washing, and he looked up only briefly when she entered. Thought we could try for apple preserves today, he said, sliding another handful of slices into the pot. Her hands reached automatically for the wash basin. We'll need more jars. There's a crate under the root cellar bench. I'll bring it in once the sun's up. That quiet rhythm between them had become something she leaned into without thinking. Not for comfort. For steadiness. For the sense that her presence here wasn't borrowed, it was stitched into the days now, weathered and real. Later, as she stood outside hanging damp linens on the line, a wagon creaked up the lane, its wooden wheels crunching through the frost-bitten earth. Noelle turned, blinking against the glare off the snow patches. A man sat high on the seat, reins loose in his lap. He was older than Nathaniel, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a coat patched at the seams. The wagon bed held sacks of feed and a bundle of timber. He raised a hand in greeting. Morning, miss? Nathaniel around? She nodded toward the barn. He's tending the sorrel. The man gave her a polite nod, then guided the team forward. Noelle watched until the wagon disappeared behind the barn, then turned back to her work, the clothespins stiff between her fingers. She hadn't expected visitors. She hadn't asked who Nathaniel knew or what neighbors passed through. When Nathaniel returned an hour later, he set a small sack of flour on the table and rested one hand on the back of a chair. Emery brings supplies from the general store every third week. Trades feed and timber for credit. She folded the last of the linens into the basket. He see many people out here? Mostly ranches east of us. Doesn't usually stop unless I've left a note. She met his gaze. You told him I was here. I did. He didn't look away. He asked if you were kin? I said you were staying. That was enough for him. She sat slowly. And if someone asks more than that? They won't. How can you be sure? Because you belong here. That's all anyone needs to know. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. She didn't have to. That afternoon, they worked in the garden, pulling up the last of the turnips and laying straw over the earth before the freeze set deep. Nathaniel passed her a spade, his hands dirt-smeared, and she knelt beside him without hesitation. You think about having animals? She asked, keeping her eyes on the soil. He glanced at her. Beyond the horses? Goats, maybe. Or a milk cow. I thought about it. She pressed the spade into the earth. I know how to handle livestock. He didn't answer right away. Then, you thinking of staying long enough to need a cow? She set the spade down and looked at him. I've been thinking about what I need. And what I want. Nathaniel leaned back on his heels, resting his forearms across his knees. What's the difference? She squinted up at the sky. Need keeps you moving. Want makes you stop. The wind picked up, lifting the edge of her shawl. Nathaniel reached across, tucking it gently over her shoulder again. Then I hope you keep wanting this place, he said. She held his gaze. It's not the land I'd be staying for. He didn't smile. He just kept looking at her like he had understood something essential. That night, after the dishes were dried and the chairs turned inward to the fire, she brought her sewing to the hearth and sat beside him. He was carving something from a piece of pine, his blade moving slow and precise. She didn't ask what it was. I left behind a name that used to mean something, she said finally. Back in Kansas, folks knew the Zimmermans as horse breeders. My father's name was good. Nathaniel looked up, setting the wood aside. It still is. She shook her head. I'm not sure what it means now. Out here, I'm just someone who arrived in the rain. To me, you're the woman who helped mend the fence before I asked. She smiled, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. That's not much of a reputation. Maybe not to some. But I'd take it over any name with weight behind it. The fire popped softly between them. Would you ever want children? She asked. The question hung in the quiet, not abrupt, just honest. He looked at her hands where they moved steadily over the fabric. I would. If the woman beside me wanted them too. Noelle didn't answer right away. She tied off her thread and folded the cloth. I used to think I'd never raise a child in a world like the one I came from. And now? She set the cloth aside and looked at him fully. Now I think maybe this place could raise something good. Nathaniel reached across the space between them. Not with urgency, just a palm turned upward. She placed her hand in his. They sat like that for a long time. The fire burned low, and outside, the land settled deeper into the season's hush. The first hard freeze came with a stillness that settled deep into the soil, and when Noelle stepped outside just after sunrise, the breath in her chest caught. The world had changed overnight. The grass lay crisp and silver beneath a pale sky, and the air smelled of pine and distant smoke, stretched thin by cold. Nathaniel was already by the woodshed, splitting logs with a kind of quiet focus she'd come to recognize, not urgency, just purpose. He paused only briefly when he saw her, then lifted another round onto the stump. There's a town meeting in Sweetwater next week, he said between swings. They'll be electing a new justice of the peace. I thought we could ride in together. She rubbed her hands together, breath puffing. I've never been to Sweetwater. He set the axe against the wall. It's not much. One street with a dry goods store, a blacksmith, and a church that doubles as a hall. But there's a woman there who keeps a dress shop. Might be worth visiting. She raised an eyebrow. You think I need a new dress? I think you might want one. For the winter. He wiped his hands on a rag. And maybe for the dance they hold after the vote. Noelle leaned against the porch post. Do you plan on dancing? If you'll go with me. He didn't say it lightly. There wasn't a trace of teasing in his face. She nodded once. Then I'll need a dress. That afternoon, while Nathaniel rode out to check the southern boundary fence, Noelle sat at the old writing desk near the parlor window, leafing through a folded list she found in a drawer. It was written in a careful hand, his, with names of things needed, things repaired, things worth doing. At the bottom, a single line stood out. Build coop near the cottonwood. She stood, wrapped her shawl tight, and went out back. The cottonwood stood tall and bare, branches reaching up like questions. She circled it slowly, then crouched near the roots where the frost hadn't reached. The soil was softer here. Sheltered. She could almost see the frame of it already, a sloped roof, for nesting boxes, a small ramp. She rose, brushing her hands on her skirt, and turned to fetch the tools from the barn. By the time Nathaniel returned, the first boards had been measured and marked. She was sitting on an upturned bucket, squinting at the grain of a plank when he stepped around the corner. "You started without me," he said, surprised. "You said near the cottonwood," she answered. "I figured I'd get the frame laid while the ground's still soft." He crouched beside her, running a hand over the cut edge. "You plan straight. I build what I can count on." Nathaniel looked at her then, not at the wood, not at the tree, but at her face, like the words had told him more than she'd meant them to. After supper, he lit 2 lanterns and brought them out to the porch. She followed with a hammer and the rest of the boards. They worked together in the dark, the cold sharp on their cheeks, their breath curling in the lamplight. "You ever think about making this official?" he asked as he held a board steady. She paused, nails between her fingers. "You mean the coop?" "I mean you and me." The hammer hung still in her hand. He didn't look at her, just kept one steady hand on the frame. "I'd like to marry you, Noelle. Not because it's expected. Because I want you beside me. Every season." She blinked hard, set the nail, drove it in with 2 clean strikes. "You didn't ask," she said finally. He turned to face her. "I'm asking now." She set the hammer down, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the chill. "I thought I was just passing through," she said. "But I don't want to pass through anymore." Nathaniel's voice dropped low. "Then stay. For all of it." She reached for his hand. "Yes." He wrapped his fingers around hers like he'd been waiting to do it for years. They finished the coop that night. The lanterns burned low, and the frost crept thick over the grass, but neither of them felt the cold. Not when every nail driven into it felt like a promise. Not when every glance held something certain and quiet and strong. The land didn't need to speak. It just held them steady. The morning of the Sweetwater trip was clear and still, the skies stretched soft and pale above the frost-washed earth. Noelle wore the new wool dress she'd chosen from the seamstress's small shop, a slate blue cut with care, the hem brushing just above her boots. Nathaniel had hitched the wagon early and stood waiting near the barn, coat buttoned, scarf tucked close at his throat. She climbed up beside him, settling her hands in her lap. He offered her a quiet glance before clicking to the team, and they set off down the washed-out road that wound along the ridge. The land opened wide as they rode, golden stubble fields and dry creeks giving way to low hills dotted with juniper. The mountains in the west still wore their first dusting of snow. Noelle traced a line of them with her gaze, the hush between them not empty, but full with a steady kind of knowing. Halfway to town, Nathaniel broke the quiet. "I've been thinking about building a smokehouse. There's room near the edge of the orchard. Would be good come winter." She nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "I can help cure the meat. My mother used to rub pork shoulders with salt and juniper ash." Held through the worst of the cold. Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Sounds like you've already made up your mind to stay through winter." Her hand found the edge of the bench. "I did. The night we finished the coop." They rode the rest of the way in easy silence. Sweetwater crept into view with its low, square buildings and the steady bustle of townsfolk gathering near the church steps. A banner hung above the door, hand-painted in bold strokes, "Community Meeting and Harvest Social." Nathaniel helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering at her waist a moment longer than needed. Noelle's boots clicked against the packed earth as they crossed to the hall. Inside, the air was warm with bodies and the scent of baked apples. A woman with graying hair and a linen apron approached, her eyes flicking over Noelle's dress with interest. "You're the one staying with Ellery," she said, voice plain. Noelle met her gaze. "I am." The woman's expression didn't soften, but she nodded once. "You're welcome here. Name's Ruth Jensen. I keep the schoolhouse when it's open." Nathaniel stepped forward. "She's with me, Ruth. We'll be marrying before the snow sets in." It wasn't a surprise. Noelle had known it was coming, had been walking toward it every day since she lit her first fire in his kitchen, but hearing it aloud, in front of others, settled something in her chest. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of handshakes, introductions, and warm cider. Nathaniel stood close, never speaking for her, but always near enough that she felt the quiet gravity of his presence. When the voting was done and the benches pushed to the walls, a fiddler struck up a reel, and couples turned to the center of the floor. Nathaniel held out a hand. "Dance with me?" She set her cup aside. "Only if you promise not to lead too fast." His grin was quiet, his hand sure. They danced through 2 songs, then 3, her skirts sweeping against the worn floorboards, his hand steady at the small of her back. Between turns, he looked at her like they already belonged to each other. By the time they returned home, night had fallen thick and cold. Stars blinked sharp above the roofline, and the horses moved slow with weariness. Nathaniel stabled them while Noelle lit the lanterns inside and warmed a pot of beans left from the night before. They ate in the hush that came after long days, their knees brushing beneath the table, their eyes catching and holding in the lamplight. When the dishes were cleared and the fire built up again, Nathaniel stepped into the bedroom and returned with a small wooden box. He set it in front of her without a word. Inside, on a square of folded linen, lay a ring, silver, simple, the bands smooth and unornamented. "I carved it from coin," he said. "Took it to the smith in town to be shaped proper." She touched it, the weight of it cool against her fingers. "You kept this hidden? I wanted to give it to you when you could say yes without doubt." She looked up, her voice even. "I've known my answer since I saw the shelf you built for my things." He reached for her hand. "Then say it." "Yes." They married the following Sunday, beneath the cottonwood where the coop now stood finished and filled with hens. Ruth Jensen read the vows, and Nathaniel's hand never left hers. There were no guests beyond the few neighbors who had taken them in as their own. There was cider, and bread warm from the stove, and a sky so wide it felt like forever stretched above them. That winter, the snow came early. They filled the smokehouse with venison and salted pork, stacked the woodshed high, and sealed the windows with wool cloth. Noelle planted onions in the cellar boxes and stitched blankets from old feed sacks. Nathaniel mended harnesses by lamplight and built her a cabinet for herbs she dried above the stove. In the evenings, they read by the fire, her voice low, his hand resting over hers. Sometimes they spoke of the spring to come. Sometimes they said nothing at all. When March broke the frost and the first melt ran cold through the creek, Noelle stood barefoot at the threshold, the sun warm against her closed eyes. Behind her, Nathaniel stepped close, his hands settling at her hips. "You ready?" he asked. She opened her eyes. "For everything." He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that didn't chase anything, only affirmed what they'd already built. They stayed on that land, built a life traced in fences and furrows, in firewood stacked and foals born in the dark. Their love was not loud, not marked by grand words or gestures. It was in the way he filled her cup before his own, in how she laid out his gloves each morning without thinking, in how they moved through the world as one steady thing. And when the first child came, a girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet, Nathaniel held her close and whispered, "You were born in a house full of love." Noelle, watching from the bed, reached for his hand. Together, they weathered all seasons.